This is a 2019 Honda Passport, and it's rugged. Or at least Honda tells us that it's rugged. It's essentially a smaller version of the Pilot that's less family-oriented and more go-anywhere-oriented. It's intended to be a car for active lifestyle people who want to get out on the sand, but they find the Pilot to be a little too suburb family. Today, I'm going to review it. I've borrowed the Passport from Honda of El Cajon, which is my local Honda dealership here in the San Diego area. Obviously, Honda of El Cajon has all the new Honda models, including the new Passport, which has just gone on sale to become the 4th SUV in Honda's growing lineup. But the other ones make a little bit more sense. You have the small, the HR-V, you have the medium, the CR-V, and then you have the large, the Pilot. So where does the Passport fit in? Well, it's supposed to fit in between the CR-V and the Pilot, competing against other mid-size SUVs with 2 rows of seats, like the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the Ford Edge, the Nissan Murano, and the Toyota 4Runner. Now, interestingly, the Passport starts around $32,000, which is just a little bit more expensive than the Pilot, even though the Passport has fewer seats. But then the Passport makes up for it in other ways. This is supposed to be the rugged, cool mid-size Honda SUV, sort of like the Jeep Grand Cherokee or the Toyota 4Runner of the Honda lineup. According to Honda, people who buy Passports are supposed to look at the Pilot and say, look at that average, boring family transport device. Good thing I got something rugged and cool. Now, personally, I'm not really buying it, because when I think rugged, I think of this or this or this, but that's what Honda says. And today, I'll see what I think. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Passport, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the Passport, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also rounded up a list of some unusual off-roader SUVs and trucks currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Passport with what I consider to be the single most bizarre infotainment system quirk of any car I have ever reviewed. And I don't say that lightly, because I get in a lot of cars, but check this out. You can go into the infotainment system into a configurable setting called Adjust Outside Temp, and then there is an option that allows you to adjust the outside temperature display by a few degrees. So you can go in here and you can change the outside temperature reading by a few degrees to make it say something different than what it's actually measuring. Why is this on here? Is this for people in like Chicago in the middle of February to just feel better about themselves? No, it's not 12 degrees. I can change it. Now it's 17 degrees. Ah, it feels a lot warmer. What is the possible purpose of this feature? But you can see it works exactly as you might think. It's currently 54 degrees outside. I go into this thing, I set the temperature to be changed down by 5 degrees, press save, and then you can see now the temperature reading says 49 degrees, and I have just changed the exterior temperature display. Why even have that if you're just going to change it around? What a bizarre feature, but you can change the temperature outside if you get a Honda Passport. Next up, this car has more quirks than you might expect, and next I'm going to move on to a little line at the top of the gauge cluster. Now, I get in this car, I turn it on, and I notice there's a little green line at the top of the gauge cluster, which I thought was just a nice little green piece of trim. Well, it turns out that it's actually a lighting strip that monitors how efficiently you're driving. If you're driving very efficiently, it's green. But if you floor the accelerator, the green goes away and it turns gray. You can see I'm kind of going back and forth on and off the accelerator here, and you can see the line at the top of the gauge cluster changing from green to gray depending on whether I'm on or off the accelerator. So this little light strip in the gauge cluster basically tells you if you're driving efficiently enough, and if you aren't, you look down and you're like, oh no, it's not green. I have to make it go green. And so you lay off the throttle. Very unusual. Next up, another unusual item in the gauge cluster in this car. Like I mentioned, Honda is pitching the Passport as sort of the rugged alternative to the Pilot. And so you can go into the gauge cluster and have the car constantly displaying what what your all-wheel drive system is doing at any given moment. Some advanced off-roaders have this feature, but the Passport does too. Now, the interesting thing about it is when you start driving, these little blue lines show up next to the all-wheel drive system, depending, I guess, on how fast you're going, showing you that the wheels are, in fact, turning. It doesn't provide like angles and tilt angle of the vehicle and steering angle and current wheel position on the off-road surface like you get in a Jeep or a Raptor, but it's something, I guess. Now, another interesting item in the Passport is its drive mode selector. Now, in a lot of modern cars, you have normal, sport, and eco. Not the Passport. The Passport is a rugged off-road vehicle, and so it has off-road drive modes. To go between them, you press this little button in the center console that I guess is supposed to resemble the Passport on like a road. You press that, and then you can switch between 4 different drive modes which appear in the gauge cluster. You have normal, and that just appears as the Passport on a normal road. Then you have snow, and that appears as the Passport on a snowy road. Then you have mud, and the Passport is trudging through the mud. But my personal favorite is sand mode for all the people who are going to take their Passports on the sand dunes. And you select sand and you have an image of the Passport driving through sand to get to your destination. Now, I'm not exactly sure what effect these off-road modes actually have. Does it really change anything with the drivetrain? But it has off-road modes, which of course is more than you can say for the Pilot. Now, next up, next to that little off-road mode selector button in the middle in the center console, you probably saw the gear selector in this car, which is very unusual. They've gotten rid of any gear lever. Instead, you just have 4 buttons, actually 3 buttons and a switch. You have park at the top, which is a button flanked by red lights. If you want to put it in reverse, it's actually a switch you have to pull towards you. I guess Honda figures it's better to require a little bit more confirmation and effort if you want to actually go into reverse. If you select reverse, the 2 lights on either side turn green. Now you go into neutral, and once again, you have 2 lights on the side, they light up as red, and finally you have D/S for drive/sport mode. You press that, and there's a green circle that lights up around it to let you know that you're in drive. It's kind of an unusual gear selector. Everybody's doing different things with gear selectors to try to free up space in the center area, and this is one of the stranger options on the market currently. Now, next up, another interesting item in this car. Most of the buttons are gray or black plastic, just like in almost every car, but there is an exception. To the left of the steering wheel, there is a big green circle button that says Econ. I guess that puts you in economical driving mode to conserve fuel, and you want to press it because it's this big green button. So you push it, and then in the gauge cluster, a leaf shows up, proving just how economical that driving mode really is. Now, speaking of the gauge cluster, I should mention that you can program that center screen to show various different items. You don't only have to be looking at your all-wheel drive system to see how it's functioning. You can also look at your current navigation, destination, compass, that sort of thing. Now, one other item you can monitor in the gauge cluster screen there, you can check out your maintenance intervals, and specifically you can look at your oil life. Although when you click on oil life, in this vehicle it says 100%, it's a brand new car, and then it says A. Yeah, that's right. We got the A oil in this thing. We don't have any B oil. No, I don't know what that means. Next up, another unusual item in that gauge cluster screen. This car has a tachometer, which in itself is actually kind of unusual. Tachometers showing your engine speed are becoming more and more uncommon as more cars transition to automatics and CVTs. People just don't need to know that info. But this car has one, and it's arranged in this weird horizontal display at the top of the screen. So as you rev your engine or increase your speed, the tachometer goes from side to side at the top of that screen. It's kind of an odd display and an odd function, but if you want, you can just turn it off. That's right, this car has a tachometer that allows you to decide whether you want to see it or not. If you simply don't ever want to know your vehicle's engine speed, well, I guess you don't have to. You can just turn it off. In another quirk up front, moving up to the ceiling next to the mirror, you have the sunglasses holder. You open it up, it holds the sunglasses, but it has a dual purpose. If you only open it halfway, it's also a mirror that can show you what's going on in your interior. Now, a while ago, I reviewed the Honda Odyssey, which has a camera that can show you what's going on in your interior. This vehicle doesn't have that, and with only 2 rows of seats, it doesn't really need it, but you do have this helpful mirror if you want to keep an eye on what's going on behind you. And so with that in mind, next up we move on to the rear seat in the Passport, and the first thing I noticed when climbing back here is it is surprisingly roomy in the back of this car. I'm 6'4", and I mentioned that to give you an idea of how much space you have back here. I have several inches of knee room with the front passenger seat in a pretty far back position. But more importantly, I just have a ton of headroom, like 3 or 4 extra inches. You could easily get full-sized adults back here and they would be comfortable. Now, next up, this is the Passport Elite, the top trim level. It has a sticker price of right around $45,000. And you get a lot of nice luxury features with that. Obviously leather seats, but you also get heated rear seats, which is a nice touch. You can turn them on and have your rear passengers' butts be warmed. Other interesting items in the back seat of the Passport. One is the fact that obviously there are little storage pockets on the backs of the front seats. Most cars have that, but you also have a little extra storage pocket in the front seat back for like small item storage. If you want to stick maybe a pen or a small water bottle in there to keep it separate from the rest of the stuff you have back there. That's actually pretty smart thinking. Now, next up, we move around to the back of the Passport where there are a couple of interesting items worth noting. I want to start with this label right here. This little label tells you how you can open the hands-free tailgate by sticking your foot under the bumper with the key in your pocket, and then it will automatically open. That's fine, nothing particularly special about that. Most cars have that now. The special thing though is the fact that a lot of people buy the car and then leave this label on the tailgate. They don't know they're supposed to remove it, they don't notice it, and so they're driving around with what looks like a bumper sticker advertising how to open the tailgate, and I find this hilarious whenever I see it. It's like how some people put on a bumper sticker for their favorite sports team. Oblivious people who get these vehicles have a bumper sticker for how to open their tailgate so everybody around them can know. And next up, talking about the rear of this car, I want to talk about maybe its most important characteristic, and that is the big difference between the Passport and the Pilot. Now, up front, it basically is a Pilot. To me, they look virtually identical, but the big change comes back here. The Passport is about 6 inches shorter than the Pilot, which is not a small number. And that's where Honda gets the idea that this thing is sort of a more sporty, rugged, active lifestyle vehicle, because it's quicker than the regular Pilot, and because removing this extra length back here allows them to free up some departure angle for off-roading. Again, I don't know how true that actually is, but that's what happened. And next up, moving on to the cargo area, you can see the other big change for the Passport over the Pilot, and that is that the Passport has removed the Pilot's third row of seats. By shortening up the vehicle and making it lighter and therefore faster, they have also gotten rid of these extra seats back here, and so it's less practical. And so you may be thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you spend about the same money for a less practical vehicle? But I have to admit, I kind of get the idea of it. People who don't have kids don't like the idea of driving around in a 3-row family SUV. It just seems too suburban family. But when you take out a row of seats, like for example the Range Rover, the Porsche Cayenne, the Jeep Grand Cherokee, suddenly it seems a little bit cooler than your regular old midsize SUV. And so that's what Honda has done here. Whether that's actually a successful strategy obviously remains to be seen. Now, since I'm back in the cargo area, a couple of other interesting items worth noting back here. One is the fact that there are 4 individual storage cubbies within the floor. You can see one over on the driver's side, there's another on the passenger side, another you have to actually open up the cargo floor, and there it is for stuff you don't want rolling around or stuff you want to hide. And then another one you have to open up the floor even further, and there it is next to the spare tire if there's something you really want to hide and keep out of your cargo area. One other noteworthy item in the cargo area of the Passport, you can drop the back seats very easily back here. You don't have to go up there and fumble with a bunch of latches and switches. Instead, you just press this little plastic button on the side of the cargo area and the seats fall. It's not power operated, but nonetheless, you press it, they drop. It is surprisingly satisfying when you do that. And next up, moving around to the front of the Pilot, first I want to talk about one interesting exterior styling on the side. That would be black wheels. I'm not the biggest fan of black wheels. I like wheel designs and I like to see them, so I like sort of silver, regular aluminum looking wheels. But black wheels has become insanely common, and you know how you know it's really everywhere? When Honda starts putting it on their mid-size crossovers. That's how you know the trend has really exploded. Another interesting styling design item with the Passport is the headlight. Now you can see this headlight assembly is absolutely massive. This bottom part is just huge, and it curves all the way around. It has like a second upper part, which is also very large, and then over on the side there's this orange reflector. It's just a very large, big headlight assembly. No other way to put it. So where is the turn signal? Well, it's down in the bumper. Despite all of that space in the giant headlight assembly, they couldn't fit the turn signal in there. They had to stick it down in the bumper. And next up, we move under the hood. Nothing particularly interesting under here, but you can see this vehicle's power plant, which is a 3.5 liter V6, 280 horsepower, 262 pound-feet of torque, which frankly are pretty healthy numbers. The most interesting thing I think under the hood is the fact that Honda has an engine cover on this engine that labels it as the Earth Dreams engine. You know that engine names have simply gone too far when we're calling stuff the Earth Dreams. You know, you have the North Star and then the EcoBoost, and now we moved on to Earth Dreams. I can't wait for Toyota to come out with a competitor to this engine called the Toyota Puppy Meadows or some other stupid thing. And next up, we move back into the Passport to go over some of the quirks and features of the infotainment system, in addition to being able to adjust the outside temperature. Now, I already covered this infotainment system in greater depth when I reviewed the Honda Odyssey last year, and I'll link that video in the description below so you can check out the infotainment system if you want to see more. In this video, I'm only going to touch on some of the more interesting quirks and features that I've just discovered, and the biggest one is just how insanely configurable Honda's infotainment technology is. I totally forgot about this, but it's just insane. You can just change, configure, customize an unbelievable amount of stuff in this car. I'm going to show you a couple of my favorites. One of them is reverse shift position beep. And what this allows you to configure is when you go and shift into reverse, whether or not it beeps inside the car to let you know you've shifted into reverse. A lot of cars will beep while you're in reverse, and most times they just do it. In this car, you can choose whether or not you want it to beep. Next up, another configurability item I like. You go into clock settings, and in most cars, you just use that to adjust the time. Well, in this car, you can use it to adjust the clock faces, and you have a multitude of different clock faces to choose from for when the clock is displaying. For example, this one has ladybugs on it. You select that, and then whenever you have it just on the clock setting, you will see your nice clock face with the ladybugs. If you don't like the ladybugs, no problem. You can choose, for example, an astronaut. Here's an astronaut on your clock face. You can look at the astronaut when you're looking at the time. Now you may be wondering, why does the clock say 6 on it? Well, that's because I filmed this video on February 6. It doesn't say the month, it just sort of says a number in large print over vaguely to the side of the clock, and from that you're supposed to figure out what day it is. And another interesting configurability item in here, you can go into your trip odometers and you can see, you know, your latest fuel economy, you can see how far you've gone since the last reset, all that usual stuff. But the interesting item here is that you can configure when the trip odometer resets, and you have 3 options. One is it can reset every single time you start the car. Another is you can manually reset it. Those are pretty common. But then there's a third option. You can configure it to reset every time you fill it up with fuel, which is kind of cool. If you're on a road trip, you want to see how many gallons you're using, measure your fuel economy, whatever, you might not remember to reset your trip odometer every single time, but in this car you can configure it to reset automatically whenever you refuel it. And so that's a close look at the quirks and features of the Honda Passport. Now it's time to get this out on the road and drive it. All right, driving the Passport. Now, before I get into a discussion of the driving experience, I want to talk about a little bit about the market position of this car, because I think a lot of people are going to look at this and say, wait a minute, this is a less practical Pilot, but it costs the same or even a little bit more. How do they justify that? And more importantly, why would they do it? But I think the theory here is, like I mentioned, there are people who don't have kids who won't buy a 3-row vehicle. And so Honda sees kind of an opportunity there. You look at the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the 4Runner, you think those are selling huge numbers. They're having, 4Runner had its best sales year, you know, Honda wants to get in on that. The problem is this is sort of a half-hearted attempt, because even though this car is being pitched as an off-roader, you know, all this capability, it isn't really. Like, it's no 4Runner. I mean, that's a body-on-frame. Even the Grand Cherokee, you know, locking differentials in that car. This is a different situation than that. But I think that the reason Honda didn't go fully in that direction is because it's expensive and time-consuming and difficult to develop sort of an off-roadery SUV. And they probably thought, well, you know, it'll take us 5 years to develop and cost tens of millions of dollars. And by the time it's out, who knows if the market will even still want those vehicles, those big gas guzzlers. Maybe gas prices went up, maybe the economy isn't as good. And so I think their thinking was, hey, we got an easy solution. Let's just chop off part of the Pilot, you know, pitch it as kind of an off-roader, give it a little extra ground clearance in a sand mode, and we'll call that you know, a Grand Cherokee competitor. It does feel a little bit quicker. It feels just a little bit faster. And indeed, in this car, I think you can feel it. But otherwise, it feels like a fairly similar vehicle to the Pilot. You know, the 4Runner has this sort of macho interior with all these right angles and stuff. But again, Honda didn't want to spend those development dollars and figure all that out. So this basically has the same interior as the Pilot. It is a nice car to drive, just like the Pilot is a nice car to drive. It feels good. It feels nice and stable and solid on the road, which is not something I always say about, you know, non-premium vehicles. Sometimes they can feel a little tinny. This doesn't. It feels like it has a good weight to it. Front seat room is also fantastic. There's a lot of room. I like the infotainment system. Honda has gone back to a true volume knob after getting a lot of complaints about its little slider thing in the screen. Otherwise, though, I've always liked this infotainment system. Easy to use, very responsive to the touch, and it has a ton of stuff in it. By the way, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this is the 3rd generation Honda Passport. Honda had 2 Passport models in the 90s that were based on Isuzus. They were body-on-frame like trucks. But it's a great car. It drives great, feels great. I think it looks really nice. It ultimately just is a really good vehicle. And so that's the 2019 Honda Passport. Now, I understand why Honda came out with this vehicle. The Jeep Grand Cherokee and the Toyota 4Runner are selling in really big numbers, and frankly, Honda wants some of that. But I think people who want actual capability are going to go get one of those SUVs, or maybe a Jeep Wrangler, something with low-range gearing and locking differentials. That means the Passport is mainly going to be aimed at people who want something a little cooler than the Pilot, not quite as big and bulky and family-like. And to that end, this is actually a pretty good SUV, if you don't need 3-row seating. And with that in mind, time to give this car a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Passport looks nice enough, not special, but not ugly, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in a high 6-second range, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Handling is secure, stable, but not tight or quick, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor is low. This is effectively a shorter Honda Pilot family SUV, and it shows, and it gets a 1 out of 10. Finally, cool factor. This is a new model, but not a cool or thrilling one, and it gets a 1 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 12 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's pretty well equipped, but it doesn't have some of the top luxury car gadgets, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Comfort is good, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Quality is fine, reliability will likely be strong, but materials are only just fine, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is good with a large, versatile interior, and it gets a 9 out of 10, stopping short of a perfect score due to the lack of a 3rd row. Finally, value, and I think this is where the Passport hurts. It's a good vehicle, but it should be cheaper, and I think most shoppers would be wise to consider a Pilot for the same money, or a Grand Cherokee or a 4Runner for more real capability, and it gets a 5 out of 10 for a total daily score of 34 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 46 out of 100, which is respectable. I don't often review cars like this, but here it is compared to some other SUVs. Its closest rival on this list is the 4Runner, and you can see that the Passport wins out on daily categories but loses big in the weekend categories and the overall score, since it can't touch the 4Runner's thrilling off-road capabilities. The Passport is a good vehicle, but I wish it was differentiated more from the Pilot.
You have a multitude of different clock faces to choose from. For example, how about this one with ladybugs? What was it? Some creature that was little.